Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Carrie Bled. I'm the Community Engagement Director with Kestrel Land Trust, and we're based in Amherst. Our mission is to conserve and care for forests, farms, and riverways in the Connecticut River Valley of Western Mass, and we also do that by nurturing and enduring love of the land. Tonight's event is the first in our new Rewilding online speaker series. And by setting aside places where the land can heal, rewilding provides safe homes for wildlife, allows trees and plants in forests to grow and adapt, and ensures nature can exist for its own sake. Renee Seacor, Northeast Rewilding Director at Mighty Earth, will be speaking with us about rewilding as they approach it. And we'll also explore the past, present, and potential future of mountain lions in our region. Mighty Earth is a global advocacy organization working to defend a living planet with a goal of protecting half of Earth for nature and securing a stable climate that allows all life to flourish.
Well, thank you all for having me this evening and to Kestrel Land Trust for hosting this presentation. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Renee Seacor. I serve as the Northeast Rewilding Director for an organization called Mighty Earth. Mighty Earth is a global environmental advocacy organization that's working really across the world on a diverse array of campaigns and initiatives, pretty broadly defending wild nature and working to secure a stable climate. The focus of my work is on rewilding specifically, and specifically here in the Northeast, leading a campaign called Bring Catamounts Home, which is essentially starting a conversation around growing and advocating for the return of catamounts, also known as mountain lions, back to the forests of the Northeast. So that's kind of the focus of today's talk, and we can dive right into it. So I'll just give a brief introduction of myself with some pictures to bring it to life. I grew up in the Hudson Valley region in New York. I like to say that the photograph in the top right-hand corner was like arguably the most important day of my life, which was the day I learned how to ride a horse. I'm a big horse lover and grew up kind of in and around barns and horses most of my life. I ended up moving out west where I studied wildlife ecology. And I got to study that in the heart of kind of the Yellowstone River ecosystem in Montana. So I went to a school called Rocky Mountain College. I studied I got a degree in wildlife ecology. It was there that I got to do, multiple wildlife research projects. One studying kind of birds of prey in the Yellowstone River ecosystem. That's why I'm holding an osprey chick in the photograph on the left-hand side. But one of the really amazing things of getting to study wildlife ecology in Montana was getting to have Yellowstone National Park as a kind of outdoor classroom. And so the photograph in the middle is actually me in an unoccupied wolf den. And that was a pre-approved activity. We were with a park ranger that day. But, one of the incredible things of studying in Yellowstone is getting to witness an ecosystem with its real full suite of species, from the very top carnivores, grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolves, all the way down to the smallest of critters, and seeing a really intact ecosystem before you, and getting to kind of study predator-prey dynamics and ecological interactions within an ecosystem pretty untouched by humans. And so that had a really impactful part of kind of like my life and the trajectory of my career, and made me fall in love with advocating for carnivore species in particular. After studying out west, I went on, I got my law degree from University of Oregon, even further west, and then eventually came back east and attempted a through hike of the Appalachian Trail. And I say attempted because I started in Maine and I only made it about 500 miles. But I credit that hike to really re-falling in love with this landscape that I called home for the better half of my life. I deeply love the Northeastern landscape, Northeastern forests. And I think when I came back with this deep love for large carnivore species, and also a deep love for this landscape, this position in particular, advocating for the kind of return of these formerly native species into our region, kind of fell into my lap and is kind of a deep passion of mine. So I'll start with a bit of a background of the concept of rewilding, and then focus in on kind of this campaign, which I'm leading, called Bring Catamounts Home. So some of you might have heard of rewilding before, sometimes referred to as ecological restoration, kind of more broadly. The concept of rewilding actually began emerging in North America around the 1980s. There was a seminal book called Rewilding North America, written by Dave Foreman, who actually coined the term rewilding. And originally, the focus of rewilding was kind of on wilderness recovery. At its core, it was relatively simple idea, which is how do we restore and recover wildness in a world where so many ecosystems were becoming and continue to become heavily controlled and fragmented and kind of oversimplified by human activity. And so rewilding was kind of a proposed solution to that, and in asking us to imagine landscapes that were once again capable of functioning more autonomously and more naturally, where wildlife movement was unimpeded, where predator-prey relationships were able to play out before us, and where ecological interactions were able to kind of function with less human domination and control. Rewilding North America, and that book originally kind of focused around the creation and protection of what were known as 3 key wildways. And so these are known as kind of the Pacific Wildway, the Western Wildway, which is also known as kind of the spine of the continent, and then the Eastern Wildway here on kind of the eastern seaboard. So zooming in on kind of the vision for rewilding in the East, essentially working to reconnect and restore ecological integrity of Eastern North America, thinking at a continental scale. So trying to create a functional network of wild landscapes where biodiversity and ecological processes and things like wide-ranging species can persist and recover over the long term. So it kind of imagines an Appalachian spine, a connected landscape from Florida and the kind of the Gulf Coast all the way into the southern Appalachian Mountains, all the way into the Northeast and Eastern Canada. So one of the foundational ideas of rewilding, and kind of the scientific basis for the concept, actually came from a paper written by 2 rewilding and kind of conservation biodiversity scholars, Michael Soule and Reed Noss. And they published a pretty seminal paper in the late 90s, I think 1998. And they outlined what became known as kind of the 3 C's of rewilding. And so the 3 C's of rewilding are known as cores, corridors, and then that 3rd C being carnivores. So the first C refers to core, large kind of protected habitat areas, places like national parks, wilderness areas, state forests, that can essentially serve as refuge for wildlife, relatively unimpeded by human development. But what had happened with kind of more modern conservation in North America was we began realizing that protected areas alone were not sufficient for conservation in the long term. Even with all the incredible land protection work that's happened over the last century, many parks and protected lands were effectively becoming kind of islands of biodiversity surrounded by roads and development and fragmented habitat. So that's where kind of this concept of wildlife corridors and really fundamentally ecological connectivity came into kind of the picture. Connectivity is central to all of this, because fundamentally wildlife need to be able to move. Movement is obviously essential for life. Animals need to disperse, migrate, find things like mates in order to breed and produce offspring. But we're also seeing animals being able to need to move more and more frequently due to kind of range shifts that are happening with climate change. So a lot of animals are, adapting their historical ranges to go to kind of higher elevations or more northward in order to deal with kind of the effects of climate change. And then genetic diversity is a really important component of this too. We'll talk about with large carnivores, it's super important that they're able to access other populations in order to ensure healthy genetics within a species. So without connectivity, even protected landscapes can become ecologically isolated over time without kind of being able to, without wildlife corridors. And so the third C is carnivores. And, more kind of modern day rewilding, I would say, has kind of expanded the third C to be more broadly keystone species or species that have kind of an outsized impact on their ecosystems. I would consider beavers to be, a crucial ecological engineer within ecosystems that we should be, fundamentally creating habitat and protecting. But the idea behind carnivores and kind of the original frame of rewilding is that large carnivores in particular often exert a disproportionate ecological influence on ecosystems as kind of that top species within an ecosystem that, fundamentally shapes the ecosystem from the top down. So they're able to control and influence prey populations, prey behavior, and from there, vegetation structure, and then broader ecosystem dynamics. And so having your top carnivore is super important for full ecosystem functioning. Carnivores also tend to function as what conservationists will call an umbrella species. And that's because animals like wolves, mountain lions, bears, and even some smaller carnivore species like bobcats, which are here throughout the Northeast. These species require things like larger home ranges and connected landscapes. And so protecting for those species actually benefits all species within an ecosystem. And so if we can create interconnected landscapes for species like bobcats and bears and wolves and even potentially mountain lions, then everything else within the system benefits from that connectivity. So the topic of carnivores is kind of a perfect segue into the focus of the remainder of this talk, which is the idea of returning this historically native species back to the Northeast. So I will typically use the word catamount. Catamounts are also known as mountain lions, but they hold actually a variety of other names as well. So this is a species that actually holds the record for the most documented number of common names for any species in the world, which can be really confusing because even I will, interchangeably use mountain lion and cougar and catamount. That all refers to the same scientific species whose scientific name is Puma concolor. But because this species has, the reason that this species has developed so many common names is actually because it's one of the widest ranging species in the Americas. It actually stretches from the southernmost parts of Alaska all the way down through the tip of South America. And so throughout that range, it's developed a series of common names that have been used for the species. So here in the Northeast, particularly in Vermont, I hear the word or the name catamount used fairly frequently. When I was living in Montana, mountain lion was fairly common. And then when I moved to the West Coast, I heard cougar quite a bit. In Florida, they're typically called panthers, but these all refer to genetically the same species. So I just have some footage that I like to play in the background while I talk a bit more about the species. So just a few kind of facts about these guys. So these are two kittens from a den in Mountain Lion Range in the Santa Monica Mountains in Southern California. Wildlife researchers in the Santa Monicas with the National Park Service have done a ton of research on that population and have used trail cameras as kind of a way to study and observe mountain lions in the wild. You'll see here, so when kittens are born, they're actually born with these kind of spotted coat. And as they age, those spots will fade and they'll turn into that kind of one consistent tawny tan color. I'll just play that once more. And so just a few more facts about these guys. So mothers will typically have about 2 to 4 kittens per litter, and they only reproduce about every 2 to 3 years. And that's because kittens, these guys will stay with their mother until they reach about 2 years of age. They're probably only about a few months old here, but they'll actually remain with their mother until they're about 2 years old. And females will actually spend about roughly 80% of their lives in the presence of kittens. Those first 2 years are really, really crucial. They learn quite a bit from their mother, hunting behaviors, how to avoid danger, how to cross roadways. And so those 2 years of life are exceptionally important. This is another great video clip that was shared with me by Denise Peterson, who works with Utah Mountain Lion Conservation Group. These are 3 subadult siblings that are probably, just shy of maybe a year old, living in kind of a mountain range in Utah. I love this clip, one, because it's adorable, but also because it shows kind of how social the species can be. Trail camera footage in particular has been really incredible in helping us learn so much about the species in the last decade. And it's really opened the door to be able to catch kind of, rare glimpses of wildlife living their lives in, that we had never really had access to before. People will historically have often really described mountain lions as fairly solitary animals. And in many ways, they are solitary. They hunt alone. They maintain kind of large home ranges. They don't, they're not a pack animal like wolves are. But solitary, doesn't mean antisocial. And behaviors like this are really important for reinforcing and forming social bonds at a young age with siblings. And then I love this photograph because sometimes, trail cameras, you catch moments like this where this young adult caught onto the fact that he was being spied on and actually grabbed the camera in his mouth. One thing, I would say about the species too is they're exceptionally curious animals, but they're very, very much ruled by caution. And so, they're fairly elusive species. Most people in the Western United States are living in and around mountain lions and almost never see them. It has been kind of more recently that trail cameras and also ring cameras and kind of, cameras are just more kind of spread out through society and accessible now. So people are catching on more and more kind of glimpses of mountain lions within kind of urban and suburban communities, but they've, historically always been there in the Western United States. We just, they were kind of elusively moving through and never, really seen. So this is a great free documentary that I encourage folks to go and watch. You can actually access it for free on YouTube. It's called The Secret Lives of Mountain Lions. It's a great kind of resource to just learn a bit more about the species. The film actually follows a female. This is the female, and she's raising kittens in the Wind River Range in Wyoming. And so you kind of get a firsthand account of this mountain lion family kind of growing up and kind of the struggles that they face and the social bonds that they form. So these are kind of the four kittens as part of that mountain lion family. Another thing to mention about this species, so they actually live in communities and will actually interact with neighboring mountain lions. The communities are governed essentially by adult males who essentially define the boundaries of those communities, and will have multiple females within their range that they're breeding with. So I wanted to touch on the ecological benefits and impacts of having mountain lions or catamounts on the landscape. And this is a particularly kind of informative and seminal paper that was published, I think 2022. Yeah, a few years ago now, that essentially pulled together all of the papers and research that's been done on mountain lions and how they interact with other species within the ecosystems that they currently range in. And what they found was that mountain lions, they essentially identified 543 different ecological interactions between catamounts and 485 unique species. So they have this huge net of relationships with other species within the ecosystems that they exist in. And this was actually in the paper, they coined them kind of ecological brokers. And what they mean by that is that they're brokering all these varieties, hundreds of different relationships and effects within the ecosystem. So some of the most common ones that we think about are predator-prey dynamics. So mountain lions will typically prey on whatever large hooved animal exists within their range. So in the Northeast, that historically was most likely white-tailed deer, but we also had eastern elk back in the day as well. In the Western United States, we see elk primarily preying on deer as well as elk in some of their range. When you get down into South America, they're typically preying on what's called a guanaco, which is kind of an alpaca type animal. So, the typical relationship that we think about is kind of those predator-prey effects, and catamounts or mountain lions being able to help balance prey populations. By balancing prey populations, there can be benefits down to kind of vegetation layers and kind of plant diversity. But we also see benefits in catamounts helping to slow the spread of diseases among ungulate or kind of species like white-tailed deer. So in the Western United States, white-tailed deer have been, subjected to more recently a disease called chronic wasting disease. And catamounts have actually been identified in helping to slow the spread of chronic wasting disease by preying on white-tailed deer. So there's just a whole array of ways in which catamounts interact and had kind of a crucial role in their ecosystems here in the Northeast, but still continue to this day in the Western United States. And zooming in on kind of one of the ways in which mountain lions impact ecosystems. So their ecological role kind of radiates outward, through entire food webs. So this graphic actually displays one of the crucial ways that they contribute to kind of biodiversity and resiliency among other species. So catamounts, preying on species like white-tailed deer, those carcasses, or what's sometimes referred to as carrion, actually provide nutrients and food for a whole array of other species across the landscape. So you can see, in this graphic that this food these carcasses in the landscape will actually provide food for other species like foxes and bears, scavengers like eagles and ravens, but also provides food and resources for insects and beetles, and even, small mammals as well. So, in the Western United States, researchers have documented dozens of species utilizing cougar or mountain lion kill sites as a source of food. They've found that this is particularly important during really harsh winters or kind of seasonal bottlenecks when food availability can become exceptionally limited. For scavengers, these carcasses can mean, survival during those times. And then I always kind of give the example of, if you've been to Yellowstone National Park, there's a reason that photographers and wildlife watchers will kind of flock to an area where a carcass has been taken down, because it almost guarantees that you're going to see, other species like foxes and coyotes and eagles coming in to prey on these carcasses. They're just a huge source of life and food for ecosystems. So I'll transition to kind of what I refer to as kind of the second part of this presentation, which is where I walk through kind of catamount stories. I have kind of 3 real life stories of kind of past, present, and future potential of mountain lions in the Northeast. And I really like this quote by Richard Powers from The Overstory, for folks who are familiar with that book. I still find that the oldest form of communication is still one of the most effective and compelling forms, and that's storytelling. So, this quote goes, "The best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story." So on that note, I will dive into these catamount stories. So I've broken this into kind of 3 distinct stories. The first being what I call the vanishing. This is actually the story of the last catamount confirmed killed in Vermont, which was in 1881. The second being what I call the long trek. This is a story of kind of a present day, fairly famous mountain lion who trekked roughly 1,500 miles to the Northeast back in 2015 era. And then the third kind of story, which I call the wild neighbor, which is the story of kind of a modern day mountain lion who lived for roughly a decade in one of the most urban environments in the world in Los Angeles County in California. So diving into that first story, this is obviously, as I said, the story of the last catamount documented to have been killed in the Northeast. So this happened in Barnard, Vermont, right outside Barnard, Vermont in 1881. So as the story goes, it was actually the eve of Thanksgiving in 1881. There was a young 14-year-old boy by the name of James Caldwell. He was outside in the woods outside Barnard, Vermont, and he actually came upon some tracks in the snow. He thought that they looked particularly large, so he actually ran into town. He gathered up a group of individuals, one by the name of Alexander Crawwell, who's actually the gentleman in this photograph here. And he brought them out into the woods, showed them the tracks. They ended up actually tracking this animal through the woods before eventually coming upon it in a tree. And Alexander Crawwell, this gentleman, is the individual that shot and killed this mountain lion. They likely, didn't know at the time that this would be the last documented mountain lion killed in the state of Vermont. But they did know that mountain lions were becoming really far and few at that time. If we kind of, think back to 1881, when what we know about that era, this was a time of pretty intense habitat destruction and deforestation that was happening across the Northeast. With that deforestation, we saw massive wildlife populations plummeting across the region. It was between kind of 1850 and 1880 that some of our forests in the Northeast saw really the heaviest deforestation during that era, and were left roughly 75% deforested, essentially to make way for kind of agriculture, and with kind of European colonization and kind of farms moving into the region. Carnivores also, in particular, were species that were targeted for extermination and removal from the landscape. Some of the first laws that were enacted in many of the Northeast states were actually what were known as bounty laws, where folks would get paid for killing carnivore species like wolves and bears and catamounts. And so there was kind of active, what were known as kind of extermination campaigns at the time, targeting kind of these species for eradication, because human populations were kind of viewed them as a threat to agricultural communities and also as kind of a public safety risk. So at the time, they were being intensely targeted. It, of course, wasn't just, our forests that disappeared, but forests were the core habitat for so many of our wildlife species. So all of these species basically went functionally extinct or extirpated from the Northeast, in addition to catamounts. So turkey and white-tailed deer, moose, beaver, grouse, eastern elk was a species that formerly ranged in the region. Many of these species disappeared off the landscape due to this habitat loss, this loss of food, loss of prey, but also many of our game species at the time lacked regulations around hunting. And so with unrestricted hunting and trapping, with those practices of the last century, essentially left our forests bare of many of these species. The good and incredible news is that over the last 100+ years, there's been incredible restoration work, both in terms of habitat, but also in terms of wildlife. And many of these species were reintroduced and restored back into the Northeast. So turkey, white-tailed deer had active reintroductions, as did beaver, back into the Northeast in order to recover and restore their populations. I always bring this up because for folks that don't know, this history, I think it's really hard to imagine a Northeastern landscape where we don't have white-tailed deer. But there was a time where we had, habitat destruction and overhunting had left our landscape void of even that species. So, really our modern day conservation legacy in kind of, post-colonization period has been one of restoration and recovery over the last 100 years, been working to kind of heal this landscape and restore species that were left, functionally extinct. Of course, that hasn't happened for all species, including, species like eastern elk, but also catamounts. And the story of this last catamount, the reason that I know this story is because it's fairly well documented by the Vermont Historical Society. There's an incredible exhibit on display at the State Museum in Vermont up in Montpelier, where they actually have the preserved remains of that specific catamount, that last catamount that was killed, along with a terrific exhibit on kind of the history and the place of catamounts in Vermont. One of the things that the exhibit documents is this cultural shift that actually happened after catamounts were extirpated from the region, in which they kind of, shifted from being this very vilified predator that was actively targeted for extermination and successfully exterminated, and then shifted to being almost a cherished icon. If you spent any time in Vermont, that the cultural kind of iconography of catamounts is well documented throughout the state. Most notably, catamounts have been adopted as the state's official, University of Vermont's official mascot is the catamount, but there's also a slew of kind of other ways that they pop up: small business names, they're on license plates, their IPAs are named after them. So it's just been interesting to see this kind of cultural shift in the way that the state and kind of population has communicated about the species in more present day. So the second story that I wanted to share with you all is a story that I call The Long Trek. This is also a story that's been well documented. There was a terrific book called Heart of a Lion that kind of details this specific mountain lion's journey and trek across the United States. So this mountain lion actually was born in the Black Hills in South Dakota, which is essentially the furthest east breeding population of mountain lions that we know of to this day. I'll get into a caveat to that, the kind of more recent discovery actually in Minnesota. But this particular individual left the Black Hills in South Dakota, headed east. I think he left this Black Hills in about 2011. And he spent about 2 years traveling eastward. He actually moved kind of across and into Minnesota. He popped up on a bunch of trail cameras and documented folks seeing him in kind of the Twin Cities area, up into Wisconsin, Upper Peninsula, Ontario, down through New York. But unfortunately was hit and killed by a vehicle on I-95 outside Milford, Connecticut. So that's unfortunately where his journey came to an end. I share this story for a few key takeaways. One, what we know about mountain lion biology is that this was a dispersing male mountain lion. And mountain lions have what's called male bias dispersal. So males will set out and travel much longer distances than females in search of territories of their own and females to breed with. And so this was, when he left the Black Hills of South Dakota, a roughly 2-year-old male who was in search of a female to breed with. Unfortunately, for mountain lions that head eastward, they don't find females in the landscape. And so he, kept moving in search of a female, and unfortunately was never able to find one. I also share this story because I think it shows how just how resilient these animals are. This animal had to be, hundreds and hundreds of roadways and made his way through tons of human communities, all with, coming into very, very little conflict, and unfortunately wasn't able to find a female to breed with and have a family of his own. So the current and this is a map of the current and historical range of catamounts. So the dark green is actually the current range of the species, and then the light green is the historical range. So right now they're restricted primarily to the western part of the United States, outside of this one isolated population that lives in and around Everglades National Park in Florida. And so this population has been pretty fundamentally restricted because of kind of the gauntlet of roadways that exist to the north of Everglades National Park. If you've ever spent any time down there, it's fairly densely populated and human-dominated environment to the north of the Everglades. So those cats have never been able to make it out of and disperse out of Florida. Cats in the western United States, like we talked about, we have seen males move eastward, and some males have, popped up in the Great Lakes region in particular. Unfortunately, there's, high mortality rate due to roadways and also human communities that where they lack protections, and so are actually openly killed within some of the Midwest states. Unfortunately, dispersal is really controlled by females. And because females typically don't disperse as long distances as males, we don't see very much breeding activity outside of these dark green locations across the United States. And so one question I'll get in this presentation, and as I talk to folks about this topic, is can they come to the Northeast on their own? Would they be able to disperse to this region on their own? And there was a study that was done just a few years ago now that kind of modeled out how long it will take mountain lions to be to recover their populations, east of where they currently exist. And so essentially what researchers did was compile all the information that they've collected over cats that have tried to move eastward over the last several decades. And they compiled all that information into a model. And what they found was by the year 2100, we expect mountain lions to recover only about 2.1% of their historic range. And we expect that to mostly be in boreal Canada. So this red arrow, it kind of, this red arrow shows what is expected in terms of recolonization by 2100. Um, the big caveat to this, and I mentioned this just a moment ago, is that there was exciting historic news out of Minnesota just earlier this month. Oh, wait, I tried to get this to play before. Hold on. Oh, no. Oh, right. Oh, well, I might not be able to play it. Well, I will share this in the chat with you all. So this is a incredible footage taken by Voyager's Wolf Project in northern Minnesota. And this is essentially the first documented breeding female east of the Mississippi for the first time in, over 100 years. And so this was completely historic. We haven't seen a breeding event like this, before mountain lions were extirpated from that region, but utterly exciting. And this wolf project actually does a lot of trail camera work in Voyageurs National Park, and they had found you can see here, and in the video, when I share it, you can see that they essentially found a cached carcass, which is a pretty telltale sign of mountain lions because wolves don't typically cache their carcasses. And they set up a trail camera, and 4 hours later, they found 3 mountain lion kittens and a female come in, and were able to document their presence in Minnesota. What I will say about this is it's super exciting, and we are rooting for these mountain lions, hoping that the kittens are able to survive and go off and breed and have families of their own, and that we see recovery in northern Minnesota, which would be absolutely terrific. But it's an extremely fragile population, and right now have only one documented female in northern Minnesota. And so we are rooting for them, but don't want to assume that we'll see recovery in that region until we see what happens to these kittens. And so the next question I get in terms of can mountain lions recover in the Northeast is if they did come back, if we brought mountain lions back, or if they were able to recover on their own, do we even have suitable habitat here in the Northeast? Obviously, the landscape looks very different from the last time that last catamount was killed in 1881. So researchers looked to answer that specific question to see if there is habitat in the East that's suitable for the species. And the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that there's multiple habitat patches in the Northeast that fit the requirements of suitable habitat for this species. Essentially, habitat patches over 10,000 square kilometers or larger are believed to be, among cougar researchers, kind of the minimum size needed to maintain populations within isolation from one another. And so each of these habitat patches in the Northeast could have a self-sustaining population of mountain lions within it. So the last story I'll share with you all is the story of a pretty famous mountain lion, arguably some say the world's most famous mountain lion, who goes by the name of P22. That's actually the alphanumerical name that was given to him by California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he lived. So this was a mountain lion that grew up in the Santa Monica Mountains and actually crossed the busiest highway in the United States, which is the 101 freeway in California, which is actually a 10-lane highway. So it's a miracle that he survived that. After crossing the 101, he took up shop in Griffith Park in Los Angeles. So if you're familiar with Los Angeles, which I am not, but I do know that Griffith Park is the park that famously houses the Hollywood sign. And this is a pretty famous picture of him captured in front of the Hollywood sign. It's obviously a park that receives tens of thousands of visitors on a daily basis in California. And the reason that P22's story is so inspiring, and the reason I like to bring him up, is because the incredible thing about him is that the community really rallied behind P22, and they created posters and murals about him, but they also used him as kind of an emblem of urban coexistence with large carnivores and how communities can effectively coexist with this species. And I always say, like, if Los Angeles can do it, I think, New Englanders can do it as well. But he really became kind of an icon for how a community can coexist with the species yet again. He also inspired the construction of the world's largest wildlife crossing, which is currently being completed over the 101 freeway. So mountain lions like him in the future can be able to access habitat kind of back in the Santa Monica Mountains to kind of the western range in California. And so he also inspired the creation of that wildlife crossing as well. So one thing I'll touch on, because and I can talk about this in the Q&A as well, is coexistence is key to any successful restoration or any living alongside large carnivore species. And in my former position, I worked across the United States, quite a bit in the Western United States, on teaching communities how to properly coexist with carnivores on the landscape, particularly agricultural communities. And, there's a slew of kind of proven non-lethal husbandry practices and coexistence practices that are effective in deterring conflict with carnivores, particularly mountain lions. And where we see the most conflict is with domesticated animals. So obviously sheep are sometimes, an easy target for a predator like catamounts. And so properly preparing communities to coexist with the species is a really important part of the work that I do. One of the last things I'll touch on is kind of, the public support piece of this. So another question that researchers have looked into is there public support for the return of catamounts back into the Northeast? Would folks throughout the region be willing to accept the return of this species and think about something like an active reintroduction and restoration? And there was, survey work that's been completed that looked at kind of 7 eastern states within the region and found fairly high levels of support when compared to opposition. So in the Northeast collectively, currently we see about a 10-to-1 ratio. So that means for every 10 people strongly supportive of catamount restoration, we're only finding 1 in strong opposition. One thing that I will note about this survey data is that the largest component of the public that was surveyed actually was just neutral on the topic. They were, not opposed, but also not supportive. And so I think for my work has been a huge component of public education about why this would benefit our ecosystems in the Northeast, and why this historically extirpated species should be able to return. So the question I typically get at the end of these is sometimes, okay, but how would we do this? What would the next or first kind of step of a process be? Something that my organization is advocating for at the current moment is what is called a feasibility study, to look at all the social, biological, ecological questions over whether or not this species could return to the Northeast, take a deep dive on the habitat and the social tolerance components and the biological components of the return of this species, but also financially, administratively, how our agencies in the Northeast would manage for the return of this species. So that's kind of the step 1 of this process, and is where we're currently advocating for wildlife agencies in the Northeast to take a hard look at whether or not this is feasible. And then I'll just wrap it up with kind of the why behind bringing catamounts home. So, I touched on all the species that have been brought back after being extirpated in the Northeast. And this is one continued missing fundamental member of our ecosystems here. in the Northeast. And so returning them would kind of begin to repair that loss that's continued to echo through kind of our landscape for generations. Um, of course, there's also the ecological components. They're so crucial to healthy ecosystems as a keystone species. That is vital to balanced and resilient forests. We went over that at the beginning of the presentation. But also fundamentally, they can't make it back on their own, or at least can't do it within the next century. And then finally, I believe that as a native species that was wrongfully extirpated, they do belong here and deserve to be returned to the landscape. So on that note, I will open it up. Happy to answer any questions that folks might have. This is my email. If folks want to follow up by email, I also, our website is on here, bringcatamountshome.org. You can sign up for our email list or use the QR code to sign up as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Renee. That was fascinating. Really appreciate your sharing this background. Yeah, I'm sure there must be some questions out there. If you want to raise your hand, you can use the under the React button. You just click on that and click raise hand, and then we'll be able to call on you. Okay, Noelle.
It's actually Michael had a
Actually,
question.
Michael, we're both watching.
Oh, okay, great. Go ahead.
It seems to me there's no reason to oppose this in terms of its benefit for the environment, and I would assume most people would be supportive. I would imagine the largest question is human mountain lion interaction and
Oh,
fears.
yeah.
And so, how would you address, or how do you address the fears of mountain lions in our forests that we and our kids are walking in?
Yeah, yeah. No, you hit the nail on the head. I think the biggest, obstacle to tackle is human fear and fear about having this species back on the landscape. I think it's one of the reasons that I share that story of P22 and how urban environments in the Western United States have coexisted with the species. But it's, part of the fear is just very primal, right? It's a carnivore species, and so like it's just how humans fear sharks and large carnivores in general, both by sea and land. It's very primal to have some of those reactions, but I think it's where the public education piece comes in. I don't really get into the stats about it because it hasn't been proven to be very effective, but I do use them sometimes just to say that you're more likely to die by lightning strike or in a plane crash or a whole slew of things that are more deadly in modern day life. And so while there is always the chance of conflict, it is exceptionally small. And with proper public education and some safety tips for recreators in outdoor recreation communities, you can really make the chance of conflict pretty slim to none. But you can never say none. There always is a chance of conflict. It's a wild animal, and conflicts do happen.
Thank you.
I'm just going to pitch in since we're both on this
Yeah.
this particular Zoom. It seems to me that New Englanders have done or people in the Northeast have done reasonably well, though I think we could use more education. But in terms of cohabiting with black bear,
Mm-hmm.
where we are here in Western Mass, we have, bear all over. And in the last 30 years, the population just really taken off. And,
Yeah.
again, I think we need to do better about not intentionally or inadvertently providing food close
Mm-hmm.
to our houses for bear. And I would think similarly for cougar. But are there thoughts, like in the process of thinking about reintroduction, are there also thoughts or plans around large scale education for people about how to safely coexist?
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, yeah. a huge component of this, and one that we're hoping to just like grow year after year, is the public education piece. And if something like this was undertaken, make sure that our wildlife agencies and more broadly, just like NGOs and community partners, have the resources that they need to be able to coexist with the species. One difference that I will say, and I love black bears. I love that I get to see them here in the Northeast. One difference between the species, though, is that, catamounts in particular are an exceptionally elusive species. They aren't attracted to human and suburban environments. Like they take down deer and prey, but they don't feed on garbage and food within. So that like source of, that is a huge source of conflict when it comes to black bears and pulling them into human communities. But that's a difference with catamounts or mountain lions, is that they're pretty human avoidant, pretty elusive. And so you don't see them getting pulled into suburban and urban environments due to people leaving trash or garbage out, or bird feeders or those things. So there are subtle differences into how to coexist with the species, and that's just really, public education work.
So I'm seeing in the chat, Maureen has a question. Why are they primarily in southern Canada versus further north?
Yeah, great question. So they, part of their habitat requirements is lower snowpack. So they don't like heavily snow, cold environments. And so that's kind of restricted them to the southern reaches of Canada. I will say, though, cougar researchers have found that that line is kind of creeping further and further northward as our winters get more mild. And so we're seeing the species, start to, with a lot of species, start to kind of move northward. But that's the main reason for kind of that restriction.
Any other hands? So Bob said, I've heard more about reintroducing wolves up to now, as was done in Minnesota not too long ago. How do mountain lions and wolves interact in an environment like the Northeast?
So we don't know how they would interact in the Northeast, just because we haven't, had them here in the Northeast, but we could infer from the way that mountain lions and wolves interact with one another in the West. And how we've seen that play it out is that they typically will avoid each other. They'll actually kind of try to create territories where they don't overlap. And that's because I always say, like, as typical dogs and cats, like, don't like each other. I live in a house where I have a dog and a cat who are constantly feuding, and it plays out in the wild as well, which is that they will come into conflict with each other. And we've seen wolves been killed by mountain lions, and sometimes mountain lions been killed by wolves as well. So they definitely don't get along, and they try to avoid territories, and in some instances will come into conflict with one another.
Interesting, yeah. Noelle, Michael, you wanted to say something else?
Yeah, I don't want to hog the time, but since there wasn't anybody else with their hand raised, I'm just curious about the map that you shared, Renee, and it looked like Maine, Western Mass, and the Adirondacks were key areas that were under consideration. And I'm curious if there would be, I was just thinking strategically about that, what you shared about the population spread, and would there be perhaps the possibility of doing two regions that are like, say, Maine and the Adirondacks, or Western Mass, like, would you try and leapfrog, have opportunities for animals to connect with other genetic pools by having multiple sites in relatively near around the same time period? That's what I'm trying to say.
Definitely. No, totally. It's a great question. And I think like in my conversations with cougar researchers, is something that they would love to see happen, to have multiple meta populations introduced that could then disperse and connect to one another. I think it's a matter of jurisdiction and getting approval and which state, and kind of which states are more willing to move forward with initiative. We know that the states really want to be in consultation and collaboration with each other. And so hopefully, if there's proper agency buy-in and government approvals, something like multiple metapopulations might be possible, because biologically it would be a beneficial thing to see happen.
I have a
Anybody else?
question, unless
Yeah,
there's somebody else. I don't want to hog time either.
no, go. Oh, I think we have one other. Yeah, why don't we go with Bob?
Yeah, go
And then
ahead.
we can come back to
I have a
Michael.
question, another question from me. Wolves have been reintroduced in places like Minnesota, and I don't know why. I think people are not as afraid of wolves as they are of mountain lions. Have mountain lions been reintroduced anywhere, or are they only repopulating by migration?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Yeah, so wolves have been reintroduced in, most notably the Northern Rockies ecosystem and the Western United States. So there's that documented introduction. When it comes to mountain lions, the only example that's really applicable is so the Florida panther population was actually a population that was founded. I'm going to get my dates messed up, but I think in the early 90s. So they were believed to have been extinct in Florida. And then there was, I think, some wildlife researchers that actually documented their presence after thinking that they had been extinct for decades, like deep in Everglades National Park. But there was only a very small, I think, single digits population living there, and they were very genetically inbred because they had been kind of breeding with one another. And so what researchers did in the 90s, early 2000s was translocated a series of cats from Texas population and brought them into Florida in order to kind of genetically rescue that Florida population. And so that's probably the most direct example of a reintroduction, albeit there was a few cats that were already existing in Everglades, but that was kind of the process of saving those cats from genetic inbreeding. Other than that, there's another conservation group that's working quite a bit on this called Panthera. They're known for big cat conservation across the world. They've done a lot of reintroduction work on jaguars and different cat species, but not specifically mountain lions. But their expertise would be heavily relied on for something like this.
Great. Let's see, I think there's another question in the chat from Chris. Chris says, we are aware of several definite but unconfirmed sightings in the Northampton area, which is right next to Amherst here in Massachusetts. Any comment?
Yeah, definitely. So I always start this by saying, I always say never, because what we found out with the that cat that I talked about that came from the Black Hills of South Dakota and struck and killed by Milford, Connecticut. I think there was a few sightings where folks were told there's no way, they're never they're never here, and come to find out it was that one documented cat. That being said, that is the only documented mountain lion that's been confirmed, a wild mountain lion that's been confirmed killed in the Northeast in the last several decades. There have been instances of captive animals that have escaped across the Northeast. There was an example here in the Hudson Valley region right now, where there was somebody who must have had kittens, and 2 kittens were found apparently along the Taconic State Parkway in New York. So there have been multiple instances where folks have seen an animal. It's not common, but it does occasionally happen. And it's then genetically linked back to the captive and exotic pet trade. So that has happened. However, just like that Minnesota case and the cat that traveled across the country in 2015, it's not that it's impossible. It's just that it's exceptionally rare. And the the one instance is that 2015 cat, and it's almost always males that we see dispersing. So,
Renee, I have a question related to that.
yeah.
That particular cat that was hit in Connecticut. It was interesting to see the map of, his presumed path. He wasn't collared, correct? So,
Mhm.
how did they know how could they be certain that it was the same animal that had made its way all through?
Totally. Great question. Yeah. So they actually did end up putting out in some locations scratch posts and got some DNA evidence of the cat in like multiple spots. But I think the last few observations, and it's fairly well documented in that book, and I'd have to go back, but I think the last few observations, it was pretty assumed that it was that individual just because the chances of it being another cat were so rare. But there was some DNA evidence that was documented at some of those spots that were identified on the map. And then when he was struck and killed, they were able to trace the DNA that they took at that time back to those specific DNA matches. And they also were able to find that his genetics went back to the Black Hills in South Dakota, which is how they confirmed he was a wild cat and not a captive animal. So,
Wow, that's a lot of research to figure out that.
I know. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Geneticists are fascinating how much you can find. Yeah.
Let's see. So another question, how far along is any discussion on a policy support at a state level? What can the public do to support efforts? And obviously, I imagine that's going to differ from state to state, but maybe you can speak to the Vermont area or whichever area you think is most relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, like I mentioned, right now we're, primarily focused on policy in Vermont. And so there was legislation that was introduced last year, actually, that we've been advocating for at the State House over the course of the last year, to direct the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department to conduct that feasibility study as a kind of first step of this process. That being said, there's been a real emphasis in conversations with the agencies that they want a regional approach. And so I think that there will be more opportunities for other states and the public in other states to support this in the future. So I would definitely encourage you to sign up for our email list on bringcatamounts.home.org to stay updated on some of those opportunities as they might arise.
Okay. Another question from the chat. Alyssa says, I have heard the theory that we would be seeing cats on game cams if they were around, since so many game trail cameras are around now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Definitely. Yeah. I think, that's another reason that, we haven't been able to confirm any instances of cats is, there's a lot of private game cameras. There's also, I know in New York State and Vermont, networks of state-owned trail cameras for different studies. Obviously, there's ring cameras and different kind of backyard cameras that folks have, and don't have any documented instances of animals popping up on those cameras. And we would eventually be seeing individuals if we had certainly a breeding population or a dispersing individual.
Okay, any other questions, anyone? I think this was really fascinating, and yeah, I think as a hiker, I think this is the one part that does get to you is sort of the visceral fear aspect of it, and I think the point that it's very unlikely is helpful, but not 100% reassuring. It's a tough one. I think that's the real tough nut to crack.
Totally, totally. Yeah, I understand that. I remember the first time I grew up in the Hudson Valley, and the first time I moved out to Montana and went on a hike and was like, had my bear spray like clamped to my chest because grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions. And so I think there's a certain level of getting used to the presence of a different species on the landscape. And that just, takes time. But there's also we can ground it in data and real world examples in the West where folks are doing it on a daily basis and not coming into conflict. So,
yeah. Another thought that I was wondering about is, where in the parts of the country where they are common, I'm wondering, do the states, I'm recalling that with wolves, for example, I think sometimes the state can compensate a rancher if they lose livestock. Is there something like that with mountain lions too, or?
yeah, certainly. Yeah, in states in the West where there's compensation programs for wolves and occasionally mountain lions as well when those conflicts do happen. So those are definitely options for the state to look into, different, all the states in the Northeast to look into as a potential compensation. There's also, been privately funded efforts around that too. Defenders of Wildlife is an organization that in different states across the country has funded private compensation models as well. So it's definitely an option for ensuring that those losses aren't, huge economic hits to those communities. So.
Yeah. Thank you again, Renee, for sharing this perspective. I think it was really fascinating. You did a wonderful job.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you hosting and really great questions. So thank you all. Have a lovely night.
Thank